Hey, so a little piece of trivia. This is the guitar solo that someone on Reddit was asking questions about, and I was like, I think I probably could understand and explain what notes Meshuggah use in their riffs and guitar solos, and that's the whole reason I started this video series. So it's kind of cool to be looking at Stifled, the inspiration for looking at this all in the first place. And it is a cool guitar solo. There's some relatively advanced ideas, but I think actually what's really cool is there's a lot of really simple ideas as well that I think you could take away and use in more normal solos, or if you want to play this kind of really weird outside Alan Holdsworth inspired stuff that could give you a kind of on-ramp. Because I always find with say Alan Holdsworth or indeed Meshuggah solos of this style that I was always just kind of scared. Whereas now, having broken this one down, I'm kind of like, oh, you know what? I could kind of get this. And I was also relieved to see that Fredrik, when he writes solos, he doesn't just improvise them. Sometimes he needs to write little bits ahead of time or to figure out the scale fingerings and stuff. So that makes me feel like these kinds of solos are much more attainable. So I hope that at the end of this video you feel roughly the same way, that this might be difficult but doable, and that maybe with a bit of practice you could write something that sounds like this. So let's talk about some really straightforward things first. So it's a 16-bar guitar solo, which is very normal. The context is basically a kind of B power chord followed by a B flat power chord. So 8 bars of B, 8 bars of B flat. So there is a key change halfway through, and I think the way Fredrik handles that is particularly cool. Apart from that, as we've kind of discussed before, when you're soloing over just very simple chugs, right, there's no complicated chords, you have a lot of freedom to do what you want. And so what does Fredrik do? So what he does is he uses the half-whole diminished scale. And we've come across this before in general Meshuggah riff writing. And because this scale is built out of a very simple building block that's only 3 frets wide, right? 1 fret, then 2. It means every fingering repeats every 3 frets. So if you've got a cool idea, you can play it up and down 3 frets and it will work. It will still be part of the same scale. Similarly, any multiple of 3. So if you move it up 6 frets or 9 frets or 12 frets or 15 frets, whatever it is, you'll still stay within the scale. So that's pretty straightforward, and some of you might already be familiar with that. So I would say, broadly speaking, what Fredrik does with this solo is he makes it clear that he's going to play in a diminished scale with his opening phrase. He establishes his first important idea, and then he just develops that idea for the rest of the solo. And I would suggest that a lot of the development is the stuff that you should steal as an improviser, because when you have a good idea, then you can apply Fredrik's ideas for developing it. So he only has a very short idea, but he gets a cool 16-bar solo out of it. And let's have a look at that. So the first 2 bars are a kind of classic Meshuggah-ism. Basically, when you hear these 4 notes, right, the B is bent up a semitone, that's why there's 4 total notes there. You can already tell it isn't going to fit in any major or minor key. And I think this is a great way of just establishing, hey, we're going somewhere slightly more exotic with this solo. So a strong opening statement that we're going to go into diminished land. And here's where Fredrik introduces the main idea of the solo. So you can see it there on the fretboard. Basically, it's a very simple pattern. It's a 4 semitone gap, and then it's moved up a string and a fret, which is the same distance as 6 frets, right? So it's 2 4-fret intervals, 6 frets apart, right? And do you remember I said about a diminished scale? Whenever you move things by 3 semitone intervals, it stays in the same scale. So as long as he moves this pattern around in 3s or multiples of 3s, he's staying inside the scale. And that's basically what he does here for most of these 4 bars. And indeed, the same pattern crops up everywhere. So I'll just kind of point out a few places it shows up. So obviously here in this first bit, right? All of this is just moving it around in 3 fret jumps. This section here, it's less obvious, particularly if you're looking at the fretboard fingering, but actually these 4 notes, they're the same sound, right? It's a different fingering, but it's still the same musical idea. When you take it further, you have a slightly different pattern here. This is the same musical idea again, right? When we get here, this is slightly different. I would suggest it's a development of the idea, but we'll come back to that later. So he gets a lot of mileage, right? He has a 4-note idea and he stretches it out over all these bars and does a slight tweak to it and then fills up all of these bars. So yeah, all you need is a good 4-note idea and you can write your own Stifled style solo. So one of the reasons Fredrik can get so much mileage out of a very short idea is that his phrasing is really interesting. So you'll note here, even though he starts right on beat 1 in the very first bar, once he starts showing off this idea, he's never playing anything too obvious rhythmically, right? So he's got a very simple melodic idea and he's spicing that up with some more advanced phrasing and rhythm. So for example, the main idea is 4 notes long, but he plays it here in 16th note triplets, right? So the beat and the melodic shape don't sync up together. 4-note melodic pattern, 6-note rhythmic pattern, right? Much more interesting. All of these little chunks start off the beat, right? So even though this first phrase starts on the beat, here he's trying to spread things out and make it more interesting. They're also all different lengths, right? So he's got a 4-bar phrase here he's basically going to play, but he doesn't split it into 4 equal segments, right? So there's this short little burst, a short little burst, a slightly longer one, a short one, and then this really long one at the end. By varying up the lengths of the subphrase, he's created a much more interesting musical structure. But he's still got a musical structure, right? It still fits into these 4 bars. So I think there's a real elegance there. So he's playing in these little short chunks, right? And he's kind of, the first bit here is he's growing the idea, right? So we start with just the initial expression of the idea. Then he introduces the idea he's going to shift it around by 3 frets. And then he plays a slightly longer phrase shifting around by 3 frets and then another 3, right? So it's a kind of a gradual escalation. This is basically a kind of similar statement as the first one. And then there's this long section here. So this idea is really cool to me because even though it's still all being played in 16th note triplets, the melodic groups are 4s and 5s. So here we had a melodic idea of 4 played in 6s. Here we're going to have 4s and 5s played in 6s, which is really cool. So like this little group of 5 notes, this group of 4, 5, 5, 5. I just think that's kind of cool. So this, it might be less obvious, but is still a development of the original idea. So what he does is he takes that kind of major third idea and he sticks 1 note at the start and 1 note at the end. And then he gets back into the shifting things by 3 frets kind of thing. Once again, this is rhythmically displaced, right? So the first time we were playing groups of 4 notes in a 6-note rhythmic grouping. Now we're playing groups of 6 notes in a 4-note rhythmic grouping. Fredrik is kind of allergic to playing a melodic idea with a rhythmic idea that matches. And considering the band he's in, he's he's probably fitting right in there. So Fredrik's constantly finding interesting ways of matching melody and rhythm, or more accurately mismatching melody and rhythm, so that he creates a more flowing, less obvious pattern-based playing, right? Because if you just play a 6-note pattern in 6-note rhythmic chunks, it's very clear and predictable where the boundaries are on your lick and where the pattern is to listeners. But if you're doing this kind of thing with rhythmic displacement, I think it's a lot smoother sounding. And it's really given me more motivation to take all my licks and practice them in all the rhythmic subdivisions, more like a drummer where they learn the rudiments, and then they'll apply those rudiments to different rhythmic groupings. So you'll learn paradiddles, and then you'll do your paradiddles in triplets, right? And I think as guitar players, we tend to be very lazy about that. Just to drive this point home again, by the way, One cool thing is that as this line continues, it's going to accelerate, right? It's going to move smoothly into this key change section here and really build up towards the end of the first 8 bars. And as the solo moves into triplets, the melodic pattern moves into 4s again, right? So it's really interesting that as he speeds up into the 16th note triplets again, he again changes the melodic grouping. So just so you can hear, I mean, this is again the main melodic theme, right? 4 notes, and it's moving into triplets at that exact moment. So if you listen for that now, right? So you have a 6-note pattern, a 6-note pattern, a little joining section here, and then this is the main melodic theme, right? And gradually accelerating as it goes along. And see if now you can kind of pick out the little bits of the pattern. I just think that's a really beautiful line. So there's quite a few things to discuss here as we hit the key change, right? And this is probably for me the most intense part of the solo, right? Like when this note lands, and there's a lot of stuff adding up to that big moment, and you as an improviser, composer, or just a fan, I think you should hear about a few of them. So there's one thing that's kind of obvious. This is the highest note in the solo, right? That's a really good way of saying, hey, this is an important moment. Another thing going on is there's contrary motion. So there's a big slide up into this note just as the key change in the rhythm guitar goes down. So if you listen to this now, right, that's kind of cool. This note choice as well is also really intense, right? This is the flat 9th. So it's kind of 1 semitone and 1 octave higher than the root note. So over a B flat, he's playing a high B. I think someone out there is saying that should be a C flat, but I'm not going to entertain such notions. This is basically the harshest, nastiest note you can possibly play, as Adam Neely has just put out a video on. One other cool thing is it's the same note as starts the first 8 bars. So the first 8 bars start basically on this B, and this is also on a high B, even though we've had a key change underneath, right? So the context is different. So when we heard the B the first time, it was quite homely, it was safe. Here the B is nasty. We've gone somewhere else, and what was once home is no longer. So the original idea was major thirds, a tritone apart. So 4 fret intervals, 6 frets apart. Here what we have is the same 4 fret intervals, but now they're descending, not ascending, and they're 9 frets apart, right? 9 semitones apart. And when you're playing this on a guitar in standard tuning, it's really convenient because you just string skip on the same frets and you stay in the diminished scale, which is a very nice thing to happen. Now, my nerdy brain says to me, wouldn't it be really cool if the way Fredrik wrote this solo was he's going to play major thirds up from B in the first half and major thirds down from B in the second half. And I think that's kind of cool. And that does mean the scale changes, right? From a B flat half whole to a B half whole diminished scale. Someone tell me in the comments if I've got that wrong, but I think that's such a cool idea. And I think there's a lot of the phrasing ideas are similar again, right? So we have the melodic idea maybe 4 notes long, but he plays it in triplets for most of this, right? Again, rhythmic displacement. The lengths of each little subphrase are uneven. So this is quite a short subphrase. Then he plays a very exaggerated long one, and then a very short one again, right? So even if it's the same idea being recycled a bit, the difference in length, the slight difference in speed, they all create interest. So as the solo is coming to a conclusion, we're going to get 2 kind of legato frenzies. So the first one is very simple. It's still that pattern that was introduced in bar 8, where you have major thirds descending from B, which are 9 frets apart. So that's B descending to G and D descending to B flat. And all he does is he adds 1 note from the diminished scale in the middle, so it's a little bit smoother. One thing to note here is that this is a 10-note pattern. Most of the time he's playing it not in 10-note rhythmic groupings, right? So I'm pretty sure you're catching on. This is something you really have to learn to do if you want to sound like Fredrik. And again, even though he's just going to basically blast us with a simple scale fragment, he's still creating interest with his phrasing. So he gives us like a little taster, and then he gives us a big long go of it. One thing I might guess as a kind of guitar technique nerd is that I think legato players tend to have to deal with odd note groupings more than players who pick a lot, right? The reason is that picking is fundamentally even, right? Down, up. And it's very hard to end up in a position where you're consistently playing odd note groupings. But legato players, when you play a roll like this, say from the 12th fret back to the 12th, that ends up being 5 notes. And then when you play over 2 strings, that ends up being 10. So either you get comfortable with rhythmic displacement, like Fredrik, or you have to get used to playing in odd note groupings. And this is not my own unique insight, right? This is something I got from Martin Goulding, who's an absolute guitar wizard. But I wonder, when I see this solo, it's so full of rhythmic displacement, how did Fredrik end up in a position where he's so comfortable with it? And obviously there's the rhythm, the advanced rhythmic elements of Meshuggah are obvious, but I wonder if part of it was that his technique has forced him to play lots of odd note groupings because that's just what's comfortable as a legato player. Anyway, back to solo analysis. The last 2 bars are again a kind of legato frenzy, and this time it's a 14 note pattern which is played in 16th note triplets, right? And then it moves up 3 frets for the last little section. So it sounds like this. And you have to wonder, like, did Fredrik Thorndal sit down, pen and paper, and go, I'm going to play, I don't know, however many 16th note triplets. I'm going to split them into chunks of 14 just to, like, land this solo ending. And I don't think that's how he consciously set out to do it. Maybe he did. But I think much more likely is like that good drummers are playing their fills towards beat 1, right? And good improvisers are playing towards something as well. And this is the thesis of Hal Gelper's book on jazz improvisation called Forward Motion. And that's a really powerful book because it's how do people write these, improvise beautiful lines with structure, and he outlines his theories for doing so. And I'm going to suggest that in a similar way, Fredrik is playing towards this beat 1, right? He's not consciously squeezing everything in a way that it fits perfectly. He just kind of knows, like by gut, that he can end there, right? He's playing this pattern. Maybe he's worked out the pattern. He's playing it in what's a cool rhythmic grouping to him, and then he just knows it's going to end in the right place at the right time. Or maybe he just happened to stop in the right place at the right time. You know, maybe he got lucky. So I think there's a few particularly interesting and important lessons to take away from this solo. One which I will certainly take to heart is you can take a very small, simple musical idea, and with good phrasing, interesting rhythmic choice, turn it into a whole solo, because that's basically what Fredrik has done here. One other thing is I definitely do not practice taking all my licks through different rhythmic variations, and this solo is a masterclass in it. And I think also one thing I'm guilty of is when I learn a scale like the diminished scales, I'll learn a few obvious ideas and I'll kind of get them up to speed. Whereas all of these ideas, they're definitely diminished, but they're not the most obvious ideas. You know, I wouldn't think, oh, the diminished scale, let's grab a bunch of major thirds, right? It's a lesson. You must practice your scales beyond the obvious to find the interesting ideas that are worth developing. And I think for people watching this video, they could do a lot worse than to start by stealing these ideas from Fredrik and then playing through and getting the hang of all of his developments of them, and then taking a few simple 4-note ideas of their own and doing that. That's certainly what I should do and hope to get the practice time to do. Apart from that, there's not too much magic. It's a 16 bar metal solo. There's a key change 8 bars in. All you have to do is come up with one good idea and then develop it this well, and you could do this as well.